This is always so loud. Oh, right. Hello, Chris. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yes, here I am. Can you see me?
Yes, can see and hear you clearly.
This time of day, the light isn't very good. Let me see if I can move the desk lamp to make it a little bit less.
All right.
One moment.
Oh, yeah.
Just bring it in here. Now, yeah, trouble is I'm sitting near a window, but of course at this time of day, is that different? Oh, no, it's too bright. Oh.
All right, how are you doing?
Just let me play around with the light. I'll put the room light on, that might be a bit better. No, not much better.
No, I would say this is better. We can see you more clearly.
Okay. Okay, well, there we are. Yeah, I mean, you'll be looking at the slides anyway, so yeah. Good. Excellent. Right, so how are you? Yes, indeed. These strange times.
Yeah, definitely. I assume you still teaching, right?
I'm not, in fact, because I'm officially, as from the summer, I'm officially retired. So I've got some postgraduate students, but I don't do any of the undergraduate teaching at the moment. So my routines have changed.
All right. When was the last time you still were teaching some undergraduate students?
Oh, last year. I mean,
last year. All right.
Yeah, just before the summer, I was still teaching. I did a full set of lectures up to last summer.
So was it compulsory for them to read The Human Past?
I don't think we make anything compulsory, and it tends to be something which we recommend. I don't know what happens in your teaching routines, but I mean we tend to use it very much at level 1 because we have world prehistory courses.
Yeah,
and so it's useful then, and in a way that is really what it's designed for. And then we also use it selectively at level 2. It's I hope and I think it's a good intro to the various regions, and it's not necessarily the only thing you're ever going to want to read, but it sets it out sets out the basics.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, it's not compulsory for us either, but it's highly recommended one to start with. So yeah, many of us went not through all of it, but there are parts which we definitely read more and really enjoyed.
Yeah, we've just been revising it, so a new edition is coming out. I don't know when, 2 years time probably, but it's a 4-year or 5-year cycle. Every 4 or 5 years we do a revision.
How frequent? Oh, every 5 years, you said?
It's every 4 years, I think, it's the official cycle. I'm not quite sure we've done one every 4 years or whether it's been 4 years or 5 years, but it's been, we've had, this will be the 5th edition in, so it's 4 years. It'll be coming up to 20 years since the first edition.
Is it each time a big changes within the chapters? Or
It isn't, it varies. And what I think we're now starting to do is, you tend, when you write the chapters from scratch back in a long time ago, 2005, it was first published. And then so the next, the first revision comes along and everybody builds upon what they've already written, and they add new things as appropriate, take away things, correct any information that's changed. And then perhaps the second time round, you can do the same. But progressively, once you're getting further away from the original text that you wrote, you need to make more profound changes. So this time round, for instance, I did a complete rewrite of the Europe chapter because with all the ancient DNA material that's coming out. It's not just a question of adding and changing material. It's really a question of slightly sort of refocusing the whole chapter.
So overall, is the book getting thicker with each new edition?
No, that's another thing we're told about. We have to avoid letting it get thicker. So if we add new material, we have to remove older material, or we have to rebalance it in that way. So yeah, it's a satisfying thing to do in a way. It was quite interesting to start again, as it were. Think right now I'm going to do a really thorough revision and look at the chapter afresh, rather than simply what should I change, what should I update.
Do you consider this as your kind of a lifelong project? This one book, is it going to be something you will be kind of re-editing?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yes, it's going to go on long into. I mean, I think last week, if I remember rightly, did you have a talk from Brian Fagan?
Yeah.
I know Brian very well. In fact, we have another textbook, a second textbook, which you probably haven't come across, but which I originally co-wrote with Brian. And I know he still revises his textbooks. So, it's something which I anticipate doing into the future.
It was called Ancient Civilizations,
well,
wasn't it?
You have come across it, yeah.
Yeah. It is another highly recommended read.
It doesn't figure, I think, in the Durham curriculum at all, or not in a way I've seen. But so that again, we revised that. The new edition for that came out in January or February, I think, or something. Anyway, either late last year or very early this year, I think. So that's another one which needs revising on a 4 or 5 year cycle.
So are you still in active contact with Brian, or?
I haven't spoken to him since we really finalized the new edition. So I haven't spoken to him for a few months now, but
No, because his talk was also very, very interesting, and he was very enthusiastic about this.
Oh yeah.
It was great to have him as a speaker as well, and he directly kind of pointed me to you when I was writing email to him. It was like, oh, if you want another great speaker, then definitely go for Chris Scarre, and he will give you more insights on the.
Well, as you know, and I think it's what you asked me to do, I'm going to be talking about something which isn't directly related to the human past today, but I hope gives a bit of a sort of an insight into that'll be my other main theme, which is looking at megalithic monuments and early Neolithic societies in Europe, or middle Neolithic societies in Western Europe. And that's where I've done field work and continue to have field projects.
All right. Would you like to try whether your slides work and whether you can present them?
Yes. So now I have to share screen. So if I share screen, what happens then? You can see that I haven't got into presentation, but I'll put that on now. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay. You can see that.
Yeah, because we had a couple of technical problems last time, and also during the talk with Chris Gosden, for some reason it just didn't work, the
right
sharing of the screen. So we always check just in case.
Yeah, and yes, I know, and there are multiple gremlins that can get in the way of this, aren't there?
Yeah. All right. It seems that most of the people who wanted to join us are already here, and it's, I would say, already time to start.
One thing I didn't ask you, Jakob, I assume that you want me to talk for about, 45, 50 minutes?
Yes. Yes, that's a normal length. Like it depends how long is your presentation, but about those 50 minutes is completely all right. And we tend to have some questions towards the end. So
yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that's timed correctly then.
No, don't worry about it. If it's going to be a couple more minutes, that's not wrong or anything. It's just, yeah. All right. So welcome everyone. I'm very glad to have Chris Scarre today with us during our penultimate talk of this term, as we are slowly approaching towards the complete end of the first term here in Oxford. And Chris is very well known for some of us as the author and editor, mostly as of the human past, as kind of a big book for all our undergraduate students of archaeology. And he's also himself a professor of archaeology at the University of Durham. Now, I suppose retired already.
Yes, technically emeritus now, but I'm still attached, yes.
All right. And his specialty is basically prehistory of Western Europe. So what we'll be mostly hearing today about are, as you can see from the title, migrations within this area. And I suppose that it's going to be quite a lot related to the ancient DNA and evidence that this new technique brought us. So like without any further delay, Chris, I'm leaving this virtual stage to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you for the invitation. So as I was talking to you just a few minutes ago and explaining that we revise the human past every few years, and I was saying that this time round, we're just in the midst of a revision at the moment. I've rewritten the Europe chapter because there is so much new information from ancient DNA that I thought simply, revising, tweaking the existing chapter was no longer really appropriate. And in a way, I'm doing the same thing here. This is a subject I've looked at in the past, but the new information from ancient DNA is increasingly giving a different insight into Atlantic mobility and megalithic monumentality, exactly how there may be links between the different regions with megalithic monuments in Western Europe. So that's what I'll be talking about. So some of this is a bit traditional. It's looking at movements of artifacts and a little bit of megalithic art and so on. But then later I'll show you how, to some extent at least, in some areas more than others, we're getting real insights from new insights from ancient DNA, also from stable isotopes. And I think one thing that is revolutionizing archaeology in many regions of the world and many subjects is the proliferation of radiocarbon dates. People talk a lot about Bayesian analysis and how that's improved chronologies, but simply the multiplication of the dates that are available is having a real impact on understanding of many questions. So without more ado, I shall see, oh, I can't move, why can't I move forward? Any ideas? What do I do if it won't move? Ah, there we go. Right. So this is just a map showing where megalithic tombs are found in Western and Northern Europe, and giving this broad date range of 4,500 to 2,500 BC. My own work has been mainly in Northwest France and in Portugal, and in the Channel Islands, I should say, as well. But you'll see from this map that there are large numbers of tombs in Scandinavia, in Denmark particularly, and there are big clusters, dense clusters in Western Iberia, in Portugal, and in fact there's one which you don't really see here in Northwest Spain, in Galicia, where there are some 10,000, estimated 10,000 tombs. So there are really high densities of tombs, and although they are regionally distinct and there is a chronological framework to them, there is obviously some sense in which they must be connected. And that's been a mystery, an intriguing sort of problem for us for several hundred years now for researchers. And that's what I will be talking about today. So the basics. So megalithic monuments, a broad family of monuments characterized by the use of large monolithic blocks in their construction. And how does that tell us about society? Well, the use of megalithic blocks demanded considerable skill, cooperative labor, and the ability to move large blocks was no doubt intended to impress and to be an expression of power. And one of the things I've looked at in the past is how the blocks were sometimes, very often, deployed in such a way as to be visible. And sometimes you find stones hidden inside tombs, but there was always going to be a moment at which during the construction of the tomb, the megalithic blocks will be visible. And that was clearly it potentially at least, a moment to impress your neighbors with your power and your ability to corral the resources to build these tombs. Still having, sorry, I'm sorry, there it is, it's just delaying. Yeah, so here is an example, just some of the diversity of the tombs and monuments, I should say, megalithic monuments more generally, which consist not only of tombs, as we see top left, but also of standing stones, as on the right here, this one carved into a human shape on Guernsey, and bottom left, stone circles, which are only found in Britain, well, perhaps Britain and Ireland mainly. There are a few examples elsewhere, but more or less only found in Britain and Ireland. I'm certainly I'm sorry about this. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah. Sorry, this is going to be a bit hit and miss, I think, but we'll fight our way through it. So, yeah, so in terms of ancient DNA, the ability to extract DNA from the buried remains of the people in these tombs has begun to throw completely different insights, new light on who these people were. And one of the first studies to affect the British Neolithic was this one published in 2019, which was followed by newspaper articles such as the one I've highlighted here in The Independent, which showed that, in fact, in this case, what was shown was that the people who built Stonehenge were largely replaced, as far as the ancient DNA showed, by Beaker immigrants or early Bronze Age immigrants in the centuries following Stonehenge. So the idea that these are our ancestral monuments may require some sort of revision in the light of this information about population replacement. So this is what I'll be talking about today. So first of all, megalithic tombs and the megalithic people, which is an old idea given some new light in the ancient DNA results. Then I look at three areas and show you the evidence for interconnections, which is a more traditional approach. And finally, again, yeah, there we are. Then the question of who built the megaliths, new insights from ancient DNA. Right, so here we go. So the three regions I'm going to be talking about, I'm sure you know where they are, but just in case, there are supposed to be some circles on here. There we are. So Brittany, Northwest France, and Western Iberia are the three regions I'll be talking about. And I thought just to start, before going into this story of the megalithic people, I'll just show you a few pictures of megalithic monuments in these three regions, that's Britain, Brittany, and Iberia, just to remind us what sorts of diversity are encapsulated within this category of monuments. So here are some from Britain, some tombs. Of course, often enclosed within mounds, and the mounds are often very substantial structures in their own right. And then in Britain, as I mentioned, we have a strong tradition of stone circles, which is something not found elsewhere. Well, it's found in Ireland, but not found on the continent of Europe to anything like the same extent. In Northwest France, conversely, we don't have stone circles, but we do have these very impressive long rows of standing stones, the alignments or stone rows of Carnac in Brittany, where you have up to 10 or 11 parallel or roughly parallel rows of stones. The whole monument may comprise over 1,000 individual standing stones and extend over 1 kilometer across the landscape. There are larger and smaller versions of this, but there are three large monuments which do indeed extend over 1 kilometer in length. And then you've also got a series of chambered tombs, megalithic tombs, such as the one here. And then finally, looking at Iberia, Western Iberia, you have monuments like this one, a small chambered tomb. Again, originally we must envisage that it was probably covered by a mound. And then we do have also standing stones in Iberia too. But as I say, neither here nor in France do you have stone circles. And again, in Iberia, you have sometimes quite large and complex monuments. The one on the top left is probably the largest megalithic tomb in Europe. They're called the Dolmen de Menga. And then at the bottom right here, you see a different kind of tomb, which is partly cut into the bedrock. It's sunk into the ground and would have had a domed superstructure. And these are called tholos tombs, and are often very richly furnished with artifacts of various kinds. We must not forget at the same time that these are indeed burial places. So here is a rather fantastical reconstruction of what somebody thought they had found in 1685 at a tomb in France. But we can show from recent examples that you get inhumations. So these are burials in chambers in sort of free space, as it were, in the chambers, not buried below the ground, simply deposited on the surface, on the floor of the tombs, and very much mixed inhumations. So you have multiple inhumations of people buried probably within relatively short intervals of time, but involved in resorting sometimes of the remains. There would be existing remains, earlier remains, which had been moved around when new burials were introduced. So a very particular set of practices found all the way from, in fact, from Northern Europe through Britain and France into Iberia. So all of this suggests that there is some common background, some common traditions, some common understanding to these monuments in these different regions, despite the fact that in many senses, the regions in terms of the sort of pottery sequences and so on look very different from each other. So the overall background, this is a map you may have seen from the human past, which is going to be revised, I should say. The dates are now somewhat out of date, but they'll be revised in the new edition. The background is the spread of farming. So what lies behind all this is the spread of farming by the two main routes, one of them through the Mediterranean, particularly around the northern shores of the Mediterranean, taking farming communities to Iberia and to southwest Iberia by around 5,400 BC. And the other one taking farming through the river valleys and the forested lands of Central Europe, associated classically with the Ban-Ceramic, and ultimately crossing the Channel to Britain in around 4000 BC. Megalithic monuments are found in this band here, approximately along the western and northern margins of that spread of farmers. So to come to the first main theme, the megalithic tombs and the megalithic people. Now, as I've already shown you, and as you probably already knew, megalithic tombs do share some common features, and the burial practices are also quite similar from region to region, certainly suggesting there's some sort of tradition, community tradition behind this, which is spread over more than one region. And this, of course, is an idea which early researchers very quickly got to understand, or at least to understand that there was an issue here, and to try and interpret it in terms, in their sense, of the movement of people. So the very earliest attempts to understand or to interpret megalithic monuments, if we go back to the medieval period, you have illustrations such as those I'm showing here of Stonehenge. Interestingly, there is obviously in the illustration some knowledge of Stonehenge. There is some understanding of how it was built with the uprights and the capstones of the outer circle of the Sarsens at least. But the pictures on the right show you very clearly that neither of the people who drew this had actually been there, since I think if you'd been to Stonehenge, you would realize it is not a rectangular monument, but a circle, and at the bottom likewise. There's obviously, there are these trilithons at Stonehenge, but this is obviously a very inaccurate representation of the monument. Interesting, though, clearly a transmission from people who'd visited the monument, coming back and telling presumably monastic chroniclers what they had seen, and those monastic chroniclers drawing illustrations to try and bring that to life. Now, on the left, on the other hand, you see a different approach to this, which is an approach which is drawing on a 12th century text, which suggested that Stonehenge was built by Merlin, the famous wizard connected with King Arthur, and was a place commemorating dead Britons who'd been fighting the Anglo-Saxons. So magic and mystery was there from the outset. And that continued into the 17th century and indeed beyond. The large stones of megalithic monuments very quickly led people to think about giants, large stones, large people, and of course there were traditions, folklore traditions, and other traditions of, in fact, I think in the Bible even, you have reference to giants. And certainly in Greek classical mythology, you have giants. And so very naturally, people thought, well, these are giant stones, so perhaps they were built by and for giants. And you see that brought out very tellingly here in the bottom illustration, where you have some ordinary sized people, bottom right, and then the giants are bringing the blocks themselves. And I think that these views were seriously entertained by at least some sections of the population until I think the 17th century, when people began to realize, with the rise of science, that you can actually begin to understand these kinds of things by looking at them more closely, but by direct observation. You don't have to rely on texts handed down from antiquity. You can actually learn from observation, careful observation of the monuments themselves. And this, of course, is the background to the rise of archaeology as a practice, as a discipline. So let me go back. Yeah, so in the 18th century, you get the first real mention of what we would call the megalithic people. That's to say that these tombs found in different parts of Western Europe are the evidence of the movement of a people who had brought this tradition of megalithic monuments with them. So originally, it was thought that this is one of the earliest of the statements about this by a French antiquary called the Count of Caylus, in 1764 in a big encyclopedia. He commissioned people to go out and draw some of these monuments, as you see here, and he concluded that the tradition had been brought by people coming by sea, and then he talks about these people of the north, and over a period of time, a foreign people abandoned the coastal areas and advanced into the interior. So the idea is you've got sailors, people coming from Northern Europe, sailing down the coast of Atlantic coast of Europe, and then settling on the coast, and then in the course of time, moving inland from the coast. And so explaining why megalithic tombs are not just found along the sea edge, but are also found inland. But very much the idea that there is a movement of people behind all this. So that begins, as I say, in about the 1760s. And it remains very much the dominant idea in the 19th century. This is a famous, perhaps a niche famous, I should say, book written in 1865, which attempted to try and give a synthesis of what we knew about dolmens, about megalithic tombs in Europe, and had this map that you see here, showing tombs as the map I showed you at the beginning, larger numbers in Northern Europe, larger numbers in Western France, not representing perhaps the density of tombs as they actually exist in Iberia, but very much coming up with the same idea that they were built by some people who had spread into Northern Europe, developed the tradition of megalithic tombs, and brought them then by sea around the coasts to Britain, and then to France, and eventually southwards to Iberia. And then eventually, yes, here we go. So in the early 20th century, we have a similar view, but a change in direction. And at this time, from about 1899 onwards, indeed, people started to say, well, yes, there may well be a megalithic people, or certainly movements of megalithic practice, the tradition of building megaliths, the knowledge of how to build megaliths, and perhaps people bringing that with them, coming by sea, but coming not from the north to the south, but from the south to the north. And this was linked more distantly to the idea that a lot of European Neolithic culture ultimately had connections with the Aegean or the Near East or Egypt in some of the more extreme versions. So the idea was that in that understanding of European prehistory, the Mediterranean region should be the first. And so in terms of the tombs, people looked at the tombs in Iberia and reinterpreted them as showing an origin in Iberia, and then a spread from Iberia to Brittany and then to Britain. So you get yes, the quotation here. So, you know, the chamber tombs of Scotland are really have cobbled tombs with precise analogies in southern Iberia, which of course is one reading of the evidence, but not one that we would advance today. But no, looking for connections which suggested that the tombs of Northern Europe are derivative from the south. And then that idea, well, various people talked about this in terms of movement of people, others talked about it in terms of movement of ideas. Gordon Childe, who you've probably heard of, in one of his later writings, came up with the idea of megalithic missionaries, whose the sole evidence for their advent is afforded by the megalithic collective tombs and the associated cult of the dead. Now, that at least has the attraction of not just looking at megalithic monumentality in a sort of generic sense, but actually saying, you know, these are associated with particular burial cults, burial practices. So maybe what is spreading is something religious, you know, not just a people, not just, in fact, not a people probably, but some religious type practice behavior. And that practice is associated with the burial of the dead. And then in the second quote here, just like her predecessors, but in a slightly different direction from some of the earlier writers, again, saying tombs strung out along the Atlantic coast of France and the British Isles can only have been built or inspired by voyagers arriving by sea. And he also thought that they came initially from the south. So that takes us up to 1950. And the next stage in this story is a radical rethinking of it, when in the 1970s, with the advent of the evidence from radiocarbon dates, now not many radiocarbon dates at this time, but a scatter of radiocarbon dates, it began to look as if different regions of the megalithic spread within Europe appeared to have dates of approximately the same antiquity. So rather than early dates in the south and later dates in the north, it looked as if all these areas may be simultaneously developing megalithic tombs. So the idea of multiple independent origins began to be explored, and the emphasis was on regional sequences rather than interconnections. And that then leads up to very recently, 2019, where we have to some extent gone back to the idea that if you look at the growing number, the proliferation of radiocarbon dates that I talked about at the beginning, you can actually see that it isn't synchronous in each region, that there are differences between the regions, and that some regions indeed, yes, go back to this, some regions, the regions in red seem to be the oldest, and the regions in green and yellow follow thereafter. And that then again, going back to earlier ways of thinking, perhaps in the structure of the dates, in the chronology between these regions, we can look for an idea which starts in one area and spreads then to other areas. Okay, so that's the megalithic people. So we've gone from the idea of a northern people coming southwards across the Atlantic façade, to the idea of a southern people going northward along the Atlantic façade, then the idea of megalithic missionaries, then the idea of multiple independent origins. And finally, we've gone back in recent analyses to looking at this question of whether there is in fact one center of origin and a spread from one place to other regions of Atlantic Europe. So in a minute, I'll come on to what the ancient DNA tells us about that. But before then, I just wanted to look at what the more traditional archaeological evidence now suggests about the reality of connections between these different regions, between Britain, Brittany, and Iberia. So, you know, do we imagine that there is much movement of people and ideas between these areas, or are these connections fairly tangential to what happens? So we've got two options here, and I showed you the map showing the latest set of radiocarbon dates with the different colors on it. And so all of the evidence seems to suggest that the earliest dates are in Brittany, around 4600 BC. And so one option would be diffusion of megalithic monumentality from Brittany to Britain and Iberia. The other option, however, is to recognize that the evidence from Iberia is still a little uncertain, and certainly the chronology is a little uncertain. And it is possible that you have, in fact, a parallel development of monumentality, perhaps with connections, with links in Brittany and Iberia. But the evidence would still suggest, even if we accept that the movement of people into Britain was what brought megalithic monumentality to Britain. So it's not, I think, a question of an independent origin in Britain. But it could be one centre, Brittany, followed by a spread north and south, or it could be a sort of dual origins model, followed by a spread only northwards into Britain. And the reason why Brittany is important in this connection is partly because it has some spectacular and very early monuments. And so this is, it has a series of very large mounds around Karnak in particular. And this is one of them, 120 meters long, 10 meters high, so big that they were able to build a chapel on the top in the 17th century and still leave a lot of space to spare. And it has, in fact, only a fairly modest chamber at its heart, but that chamber, which probably only had one burial in it, had a large number of axes, of polished stone axes, including some which had come from a long way away. It had come from probably the Alps, the Western Alps, and it also had some variscite beads. I'll show you some pictures of these in a moment, which came from Iberia. So long distance connections as well as large size, large scale monuments. Another very large scale monument is this stone reconstructed in this diagram called the Grand Menhir Brisé, which simply means the large broken menhir. Largest megalithic standing stone in Europe and also probably one of the earliest, now lying flat. I'll show you a picture in the next slide. Fallen and broken into 4 fragments, probably as a result of an earthquake in around 4200 BC. But a very impressive site, even in its fallen and broken form, weighing 300 tons, so impossible really to understand exactly how it was manipulated and moved, but it was. 21 meters tall in its original form. And if you look particularly at the picture at the bottom here, you'll see that the surface has been smoothed all over, and there are actually facets worked in the surface. So a very, very major undertaking. And this is the kind of evidence which suggests that Brittany was a center of great prestige and power, and you might well have had the sort of prestige which could be reflected by overseas contacts and carry ideas of monument types that they had developed in Brittany and inspire communities elsewhere to want to build the same sorts of thing on a smaller scale. And so if we look at the sort of most basic level, we can see there are shared features between Brittany and Iberia, such as these standing stones, these menhirs, one on the left from northern Brittany, one on the right from Portugal. So is this a shared ideology? And we have depictions which may support the idea that people are moving by sea. On the left, you can see this crescent shape carved on this stone, which some people have suggested is the picture of a boat. Not everybody thinks that, but it might be. On the right, at the bottom of this block in Brittany, there is also a picture which may well be the representation of a boat. So maritime connections may even be depicted in megalithic art. Now, in terms, oh, I think there's one in between. Yes, sorry, I'm afraid the onward movement of the slide is not very smooth. Yeah, so we've got these connections, you've got similar monument types, and you've got boats shown in megalithic art, all of which would support the idea of people moving perhaps by sea between different parts of France and Spain and Portugal. But if we look, for example, at Portugal, Western Iberia, you will see that there is, for example, this class of tomb that, for example, is shown here, very distinctive class of tomb, which has a passage leading to a chamber, and the chamber is built of 7 stones leaning against each other. Now that's a type of tomb of which there are hundreds, if not thousands of examples, in fact thousands it must be, in Western Iberia, is not found in Brittany or Britain or anywhere else. So whenever we think about the connections, there is a good deal of regional development. There are strong, regionally distinct traditions. I mean, this is the kind of paradox. You know, there is evidence for connections, and you might well think that there must be a connection between these regions, but when you look closely, each region looks different. In terms of material that might help us to pin down these connections, then there are two classic material categories which seem to move, not in huge numbers, but in sufficient numbers, between Iberia and Brittany, which show that something is indeed connecting the two regions. So we have variscite beads, these greenstone beads, as you see here, beads and pendants, coming from two sites, two mines in Western Iberia, Pozuelo das Cuevas and Entenasola, and arriving in southern Brittany, possibly, supposed to show an arrow, yes, possibly by sea, but we don't actually know whether it's by sea or by land. So you know, we're obviously seeing movement of materials. We can't quite tell what route they're traveling along. But that is a movement south to north. Conversely, we also have the now well-studied phenomenon of these greenstone axes, these jadeite axes, which were made at these two sites in the Western Alps, and mined at these two sites in the Western Alps, as you see on the map here, Montviso and Montbégois. And they, if you look at the map, you'll see there is a cluster of these axes across France and into Northern Europe and into Britain, very few in Spain and Portugal, but there is a big concentration in Brittany. So it does suggest that, in fact, yes, that's, sorry, yeah, again, it's Mr. Jump one. So yeah, so from the source areas in the Western Alps, these axes, as you see here, they're very, very finely shaped, very, very finely polished, are traded or moved across hand to hand in some form of exchange to southern Brittany to appear in these burial chambers of these enormous mounds. And there they are reshaped and repolished, so they take on new forms. And it's those new forms which then, one or two examples are found in northern Iberia, including this type of axe here, the Tumiac axe, which has a particular form and has a perforation through the end of it, just as you see here. And one example of that was found in Galicia, in northern Iberia. And then you have several examples. The axe on the right is in fact what must be a local imitation in a local stone of that imported axe. So I think there's no question but that things are moving between these regions. But of course, what does the impact of one or two axes, or in fact, there is also some pottery which seems to move between the two areas, or one or two pendants, does that really inspire major social change and the development of new monument traditions? And indeed, if Iberian megaliths owe their origins to connections with Brittany, shouldn't the oldest ones be found in the north? Now, here, this is something I have worked on directly at 2 or 3 sites now in Iberia. The problem here is there is a problem with the reliability of AMS radiocarbon dates. A lot of the megalithic tombs I've shown you are built of granite. That's true of the ones in Brittany and true of many of the megalithic tombs in Western Iberia. And if it's granitic terrain, then it's an acidic soil it's producing, and the preservation of human remains is going to be very, very poor, very occasional. In fact, most sites have none at all. A few have very poor preservation. That means that in terms of radiocarbon dates, you're looking at other materials such as charcoal to get an idea of chronology. But charcoal is less secure because we don't know where the charcoal has come from. So the charcoal is lying around today in these monuments. It may have been lying around on the old ground surface before the monuments were built. It may have been lying around for quite a while. It may be that the vegetation was burned at some point in the past, and then the charcoal produced by that burning at a date centuries later became incorporated in the mound, or was even perhaps incorporated in some of the fill between the stones of the tomb or whatever. So you cannot be sure whether the charcoal is dating the construction or use. Whereas human remains, well, they may be later than the construction, presumably they always postdate construction by their very nature, but you expect them to relate quite closely to the date of construction. So if we look at these sets of dates we've got in Iberia, we do indeed have charcoal dates in the north, some of which look fairly early. So if you look at them together, you might think that this is indicating a date in the around 4000 or 3800 BC for these tombs in the north. But if you then look at the dates on human remains from central Western Iberia, these generally come out somewhat later in date. So you have one early date here, 4037 to 3712, which might be erroneous in some way, but the other 5 dates there are consistent and would suggest that the tombs here are being built around 3500 BC or thereabouts. To try and resolve this, we did some OSL dating, some luminescence dating at a site that I excavated at Laginia, and we had in altogether 10 luminescence dates, 5 of them from primary context, from the early parts of the base of the mound, and they came out consistently 4000 to 3800 BC. But by their nature, OSL dates are less precise than radiocarbon dates. So although that is interesting, I would treat it with a certain amount of caution. If we look at other sites, there is one interesting site right in Cadiz, in fact, right on the south coast of Iberia, with an early date, before 4000 BC. But this isn't really a megalithic tomb. It's a burial in a pit lined with stone slabs. So whether that's part of the tradition, I don't know. So I can't really give you an answer to this, but the radiocarbon dates do not really allow us to say with confidence what the chronological pattern of megalithic tomb building in Western Iberia really was. So when you look at those big maps showing all the dates, you've got to think, well, individually by region, the chronologies may be quite, have quite a lot of gaps in them and be quite uncertain. And this is just to show you, this is the sampling that we did, the luminescence dating we did at Laginia. This is the mound beside, in fact, on the left, you see the very degraded stones at the back of the chamber lying off to the left-hand side. And this is actually a section cut through the mound down to the bedrock. And in the side of that section on the right, you can see we have a luminescence date being taken, luminescence sample being taken. Now, who built the megaliths? So what I've just given you is a kind of traditional approach, although using relatively recent data. What can we learn from ancient DNA? Now, the use of ancient DNA in this kind of context has been revolutionary in many senses. For the prehistory of Europe more generally, for the later prehistory, it really became a point of great contention and great interest with the publication in 2015 of this article about Bronze Age genomics. And this was when the idea of the spread, migration of a people from the steppe region of Ukraine at the end of the Neolithic or beginning of the Bronze Age, with a very large turnover of population, was suggested on the basis of the sampling that they were doing. So that really gave ancient DNA, a really big role in the discussion about the changes that we see in prehistory in Europe. If this was happening around 2000, well, in the 3rd millennium BC, had it happened at other periods and also resulted in quite a lot of changeover of population, new populations coming in, replacing or at least intermarrying and absorbing earlier populations, and with cultural and social effects concordant with that. So what was originally looked at in terms of Central and Northern Europe was then applied to Britain in 2018. The Beaker phenomenon was shown to relate to, here also in Britain, a large change in population makeup according to the ancient DNA. And then finally in 2019, a similar study looked at the early Neolithic. So the first 2 papers there looking at the end of the Neolithic and saying there's a big change from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. And then this 2019 study came back to this, traditional point of contention about the Mesolithic Neolithic. Was the Mesolithic Neolithic transition connected with a movement of people, incoming farmers, or not? And of course, the ancient DNA suggested substantial arrival in Britain of Neolithic farmers coming from the continent. So what does that tell us about megalithic tombs? So the chronology of the Neolithic in Britain shows us an arrival in the southeast of Britain first, coming from northern France around 4000 BC, spreading steadily northwards thereafter, so reaching most of northern Britain by around 3800 BC. And get this to work. Yeah, and we've also got dates for various categories of monument. And the thing to look at here is the first two bars on this diagram, showing that the earliest long mounds, whether non-megalithic or whether with megalithic chambers, also date to around 3800, 3700. So not long after the arrival of these Neolithic farmers. And so it's quite clear there is a good ancestry for these mounds in northern France. And so, we can compare French long mounds are not quite the same, and the chronologies are not quite the same, but there is a very good argument to be made that the long mounds of Neolithic Britain are one of the traditions brought over from northern France by immigrant farmers coming from northern France. And some people have elaborated this and suggested that there was more than one point of connection, that there was a connection going up the eastern side, another the west, and a third perhaps up the Irish Sea. And and indeed, if you look at the ceramics, there is indeed some substance for that idea. There are ceramic differences. There are differences in pottery technology between the east and the west side of Britain. So all of this is consistent with a major sort of movement of farming groups into southern Britain. And of course, as I said earlier, that would in a way take us a stage beyond this. So this article in The Independent was warning us that at the end of the Neolithic, we had new people coming in. And this 2019 article showed us that at the beginning of the Neolithic, the same was the case. And there we are again. We have, in addition to ancient DNA, we have other techniques that we can use, other new analyses or newish analyses we can use. And one of these is looking at stable isotopes, particularly stable isotopes of strontium. And together with Sam Neill, who was my research student and is now in Oxford, you may know her, it was her PhD thesis, looked at a series of early monuments in Britain and looked at evidence for mobility of population. So what you can tell is whether the people buried in these monuments appear, or at least may have lived locally, or must have come, the strontium signatures are so different from the local geology that they must have grown up in another region and have come to this region to be buried, but showing a signature from a different region. And the interest of the burial there of 957 is just largely the date, which shows that in this part of Britain, this must be somebody who was buried, must be one of the first generations of farmers in this region, the first generation or the second or third perhaps, but a very early example of one of these farming societies, farming individuals. And if we look at the analysis of the various individuals buried in this Whitwell cairn, the majority of these appear to have strontium ratios which are not consistent with the local geology, so have come from somewhere else. And indeed, they're so different that they are compatible only with relatively restricted parts of Britain, that's to say Scotland perhaps, but Scotland would expect, we would expect not to be a source area for population, since it was itself, the Neolithic was spreading northwards only step by step at this period. So it would be possible, but more surprising for somebody to be traveling south at that time and bringing farming to central Britain. Southwest England is also possible, perhaps, again, not very likely. Northwest France is a very tempting alternative, and might indeed indicate that these people, some of them may be indeed immigrants who've come across from the continent. But this is very suggestive. But we would hope to have confirmation from other sites that this is indeed happening. So the conclusion for Britain is that there is a strong case to be made that the tradition of megalithic monumentality was brought to Britain from northern France by the first farmers. How does that compare with Iberia? So here is a diagram showing the chronologies. And the point I really wanted to make, I've just put this together a few days ago, is the yellow bars show the Neolithic. So the chronology runs with dates around 5,500 BC, left-hand side, 3,000 right-hand side. So we're moving in time from left to right. And I was trying to show how long the Neolithic was in each of these regions before megalithic monuments started to be built. So the yellow is the pre-megalithic Neolithic, as it were. So as you see at the top bar, in Brittany, it's relatively short, only a few centuries. In Iberia, southwest Iberia, it's much longer. It's well over 1,000 years. In Britain, at the bottom, it's relatively short. And indeed, in Britain, the shortness of that interval is, of course, consistent with this being a phenomenon where the farmers are coming in, bringing a tradition of monumentality with them and beginning to build monuments almost from the very outset. By contrast, Iberia seems to show us that farmers were farming and cultivating their land and presumably increasing in numbers for well over 1,000 years before they started to build megalithic monuments. So a very different process. And indeed, if we look at the early Neolithic in Iberia, the evidence for sites where the first farmers established themselves, they're almost exclusively coastal. And of course, we know that the farming communities of Iberia, the Western Mediterranean, were brought by sailors, by maritime communities, or by communities traveling by sea, let's say, so that there are little enclaves of farming spread along the coast of southern France and into northern Spain, and then down eventually past the Straits of Gibraltar into Portugal. And that seems to be where the early Neolithic sites were clustered. And it's almost as if you had maritime settlement and enclaves around the coast. They don't initially spread very rapidly inland, from what we can say. So they're very well established farming communities, very much coastal in their emphasis, and very largely the result of colonist farmers coming in by sea from the central Mediterranean. If we look at the Middle Neolithic, we're looking here now, Middle Neolithic settlement sites. So I should say that the sites that we're just looking at, the early Neolithic sites, are settlement sites. Middle Neolithic sites in Iberia, settlement sites are few and far between, and wouldn't be easy to map on the scale of the whole of the peninsula. But what we can do is map the distribution of megalithic tombs again, and megalithic tombs are Middle Neolithic. So we can, in a way, say, what is the difference in distribution between the early Neolithic settlements and the Middle Neolithic tombs? And this seems to show some degree of expansion inland, not covering the whole of the peninsula evenly, but it looks as if there is an expansion of settlement inland from initial coastal enclaves. And we might expect that to have involved perhaps the incorporation, the absorption of indigenous communities, of Iberian communities in the interior. So in other words, you have an early Neolithic with enclaves down the coast, around the coast, and indigenous societies still very much carrying on traditional ways of life inland, followed by a spread of farming into the interior and the amalgamation of these two communities, the incomers and their descendants, and the indigenous communities. So what does the ancient DNA tell us about that? Well, it tells us indeed that farming was introduced to Iberia by incoming farmers spreading around the Mediterranean coasts. So once again, farmers bring farming to Iberia. It's not local people who adopt it from contact with the outside world. And the Middle Neolithic samples do indeed indicate some resurgence of local hunter-fisher-gatherer ancient DNA. So they do show that there is more of a contribution from the indigenous people in the Middle Neolithic period, which would be consistent with what I was just suggesting. And so there are two studies here I was just going to show briefly. This one just shows you at the top, you have, this is one of these ancient DNA diagrams, which are sometimes a little difficult to understand, but you see at the top, the red oval shows you the classic profile of hunter-gatherer communities, Mesolithic communities in Iberia. And if this works properly, that would be the early Neolithic. So that's at the, and this analysis is at the other end of the scale. You see the pale blue at the bottom of the early Neolithic, whereas the Middle Neolithic and late Neolithic show some movement up the diagram as if consistent with the idea that indeed the genetic profile is changing slightly, not extensively, but slightly, probably reflecting the absorption of indigenous populations in the Middle and late Neolithic. So there's sort of, more of a hybridization of these two communities. And this is another diagram which shows the same thing in a slightly different way. So again, Mesolithic in Iberia is out there on the left. The early Neolithic is at the opposite end of the diagram. And then the Middle Neolithic shows a small shift again, but back towards the hunter-gatherer profiles. So that can be read to suggest that in the Middle Neolithic, you are indeed having some integration between incoming and indigenous societies. So megalithic tombs in Iberia are associated with the spread of farming from these initial early Neolithic coastal enclaves. So the spread of megalithic tombs into the interior seems to be associated with the spread of farming. It's somehow to do with the establishment of farming communities away from the coast. There is also evidence for more mobile Middle Neolithic lifestyles, and indeed, these megalithic tombs themselves may be central places. There may be places, anchors within the landscape for societies which are actually quite mobile and perhaps have a large emphasis on pastoralism in their lifestyles. And that again would be consistent with the absorption of local hunter-gatherer communities who may also have these more mobile lifestyles than early farmers who, as I say, were very much focused in the coastal regions. At the same time, the megaliths themselves, as the evidence I showed you earlier, still do indicate connections with other regions, some of them Atlantic, some perhaps with Brittany, some of them perhaps with the Mediterranean. We still are looking at a family of megalithic tombs with regional expressions. The Iberian tombs still are part of this broader family. So even though we may explain the Iberian tombs by saying, well, these are parts of the social strategy adopted by people farming in the interior regions of Iberia, where does the idea come from? Well, it may come partly from indigenous traditions, perhaps indigenous veneration of rocks and stony landscapes indeed, but the fact that there are megalithic tombs in adjacent regions, in southern France, in Brittany and so on, and there is evidence for items, as we have seen, moving between these regions, would suggest that it's not a completely independent development. So that brings me to the end. So widespread evidence that the Neolithic was introduced to different regions of Western Europe by colonist farmers, but there is a varying chronological interval between the introduction of farming and the inception of megalithic monumentality in each region. And so very much the conclusion is that there are different processes and different histories for different regions. Okay, well, I hope that wasn't, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope that gives you an idea about how this new evidence is beginning to fill out our more traditional evidence for the way in which these families of tombs might be connected. Thank you very much. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you very much for this, Chris. As you could probably hear, there was a round of applause for this presentation. You really brought a fascinating amount of these strands of different evidence to build a very strong case for the connection of megalithic dumps with the spread of farming. So it's really interesting topic. Before I will ask my first question, I would like to say that if anyone would have any questions, don't hesitate to write them down in the chat or raise your hand, and you will be given opportunity to ask the question. Right. But just to give people some time for thinking, I wanted to ask, on one of the slides, you had these kind of different dates for the spread of these megalithic monuments in like different regions, specifically like in the western and northern part of Europe, and it was obvious that it was like long-term development within the region. What I'm interested in is there any idea or is there any theory why we don't see the similar pattern of spread into like Central, Eastern and Southern Europe? Why it stops somewhere at this like border of well in France basically and Scandinavia? Why is it not like trend within the whole Europe basically?
Yeah, that's it's a good question. It's a question which is often it's a good, as a general sort of question. It's a good question to ask. If we find something in one area, that's something we can try and explain in its own right. But it's interesting to turn that question around always and say, well, why don't we find it in other regions? And in this case, it's not very easy to say. That's why the evidence of connections may be particularly pertinent here. If we take the view that megalithic monumentality really was something which was only invented once in Western Europe, we know it's invented in other parts of the world, so it's not a unique phenomenon. But if we were to say, well, let's see if the evidence might support that. So let's see, would the evidence, for example, support the idea that the tradition was indeed invented once, was introduced once, developed perhaps in Brittany, for example, where we have these early dates. And you can indeed build up a narrative which suggests that might have been the case, in which case you then have the spreading from Brittany to other areas. So then you've got to say, well, why does it start in Brittany? And you have here the possibility that you have stony landscapes. I really didn't touch on this. This is something I've written about in the past, but you've got stony landscapes. You have a whole series of lines of evidence suggesting, some of them ethnographic, some of them archaeological, suggesting that you may, in stony landscapes, have long-standing traditions of the veneration of natural rocks, boulders, and cliffs. And you look at ethnography for different parts of the world, you'll find that often very prominent, very peculiar, very striking, let's say, natural features are often given some sort of mythological association. And it wouldn't be a very difficult transition to go from that to the idea that you then create built structures using stone from those same sort of venerated sources in which to bury the dead. And that's something which, it could obviously happen in a number of different regions, but it's the sort of thing which might happen just once, perhaps in Brittany, possibly in Iberia. As I say, I'm not sure about these chronologies at all. And then, once it's established, it could be something which, because it's to do with connected with social emulation, marking your kind of prominent, your visibility, your standing within the landscape, it then is something which is adopted by other communities in other regions.
Right, thank you very much. Gary is asking whether there is any archaeological evidence directly linking farming activities and building megalithic monuments other than comparable chronologies.
Well, there are, let me think, that's a good question. Now, how would one best answer that? I can immediately answer it. There are in some areas you do get ploughing beneath megalithic monuments, or in fact beneath barrows, to show that they're sometimes being built in on previously cultivated land. there has been a good deal of exploration of the question of Mesolithic monuments, but with a few exceptions, there don't appear to be such on a large scale in Western Europe. So there does seem to be some connection with farming societies, and that isn't necessarily, in fact, it isn't to say, let me say emphatically, it is not to say that hunter-gatherer communities cannot build these sorts of structures. They can, and indeed in some parts of the world they do. There are some very interesting examples from North America, for instance, from the USA, of enormous monuments being built by communities that were not agricultural in the sense of the European communities that we're talking about here, but were nonetheless able to build large structures. So it's not a limiting factor. It doesn't mean to say unless you're farming, you can't do it. It's just that pre-farming communities or non-farming communities in Europe don't appear to have done that.
All right, thank you very much. There is another question from Victoria. Do you have any information on how long monuments were in use for? And then she's using example of Cotswold Severn monuments in the UK.
Yeah.
And yeah, what can that tell us about the fact that this tradition went on for hundreds of years?
Yeah, in fact, the evidence, well, the way these tombs are designed is that many of them, not all of them, but many of them have a passage leading to a chamber. And once you have that, you clearly, I mean, you can obviously block the passage, but you've clearly created a structure which can be entered multiple times. So you're not building a chamber, sealing it, covering it with a mound, and sealing it away and making it inaccessible. And part of the burial practice we see involves the repeated use of these tombs, the bringing in of new bodies, the manipulation of the bones of previously buried individuals and so forth, and probably the extraction of bones as well. So that, given that that's the case, then clearly it is possible for tombs to be used and reused. So you may well have, in many regions, an initial funerary practice of a particular kind, which may be, in archaeological terms, overwritten, as it were, by later use of the monument. It's a prominent monument. Clearly, it's going to attract later attention. However, there is a more straightforward answer to your question, and that is that where we do have well identified primary burials, that's to say, or primary uses, I should say, where we've got an initial phase of use, and you're not talking about later reuse after a gap, for example, that we have in many cases, we've got evidence for a phase of use which lasted only a century or two. So sometimes these appear to have been built and used for a relatively short period of time, 2 or 3 or 4 generations perhaps. But in other cases, as I say, you've got a different, well, either you've got reuse, or in some instances you have evidence that the tombs were actually cleaned of their earlier deposits completely and reused later. So it is a case again of varying practices in different contexts, different regions. But I would think that most of these tombs are probably being built to be used with the intention of being used by a few generations. And it's just the fact that they are accessible and they're so prominent that leads to them being used successively over centuries and centuries.
Right. There is another longer question from Joseph. He's asking, well, he noticed that there was like a higher density of megalithic tombs in Ireland in your earlier slides.
Yeah.
There doesn't appear to be the replacement of peoples by Beaker folk into Ireland as there was in Britain. Is it thought that the megalithic tomb builders came from Iberia as opposed to northern France into Ireland, or are there other theories?
Now that's a good question. I must confess, if you were to ask me what does the evidence for Beaker population change tell us in Ireland, I would have to think a little bit about that before I could tell you. I'm not sure that there isn't evidence there also for a good deal of new population arriving at the Beaker period, but as I say, I'd have to check that out to give you definitive answer. But certainly there are more megalithic tombs in Ireland than there are in Britain. That's one thing we can certainly say. And it has its own maritime interconnections. I mean, there are connections between the Boyne Valley tombs, for instance, and some sites in Western Britain. There is even at least one object from, I think from Knowth, which is thought to have come from Iberia. But again, it's a little bit like this business of the variscite beads and the polished stone axes, the jadeite axes I showed you. I think that is very interesting in showing that there really were connections, but it is still very difficult to say what the nature and impact of those connections was. Should we be surprised that people are in contact? And when you have individual artifacts or small numbers of artifacts moving, again, are we envisaging an individual coming from Brittany to Ireland, for example, carrying an object? Or is it something which has spread from hand to hand and ultimately comes from perhaps from Wales across to Ireland as part of an ongoing set of interactions that's been long established between those two areas?
All right, thank you. I also wanted to ask, based on the ancient DNA and isotope analysis, was there any estimation of numbers and intensity of migration of these incoming farmers into Britain, especially? Because I mean, why I'm asking this is that it would probably create different kind of dynamics of this migration. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really able to answer that. That's a bit of an expert question, and you can indeed get answers if you. This is a question I've heard put to ancient DNA specialists, and some of them will sometimes say that they think that the numbers are this or that scale, but it's quite difficult, and clearly nobody is saying that they can give a precise number. It must be relatively substantial. That's to say, I guess it's not just a few dozen people arriving, it's more than that. There is an issue behind the analysis of the interpretation of the ancient DNA, which is always that, are we looking at selected or rather selective sets of samples to analyze? So for instance, when we're looking at Neolithic DNA, are we looking, well, what we tend to be studying are assemblages from populations buried in these megalithic chamber tombs. That's where these burials are preserved, and that's where the samples come from. There is always this question about the possibility that some sections of the population are being buried elsewhere. So that could include the descendants of the original hunter-gatherer populations, in theory at least. The reason why in the Neolithic case in Britain that does not seem to be a major factor is that you do not get in Britain in the later periods any sort of resurgence of indigenous hunter-gatherer DNA in Britain. It does indeed suggest that the hunter-gatherer DNA component in the later genetic profile of Britain is relatively limited once the farmers have arrived. So I think in that case, so I don't know about the numbers, but I think enough to substantially replace the indigenous populations in most areas. We don't know how numerous the indigenous hunter-gatherers were either. It's a bit of a difficult question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Are there any burning questions within the?
Old issue, but are there any regional variations in the axial arrangement of monuments which might or might not have any relation to astronomical observation uses?
Could you hear that question?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that very well. Could you summarize it?
Can you come here and ask it yourself? Yeah.
It's an old issue, but I'm wondering if there are regional variations in the axial arrangement of monuments which might or might not throw any light on understandings of or uses of astronomical observation.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question again. I mean, it's yeah, these are good set of questions. Yes, now that's something which I think, in my view, has not been given enough attention. What has sometimes happened is I think that people have, a lot of researchers have looked at astronomical orientations on the sun or the moon or possibly other celestial features, and they've shown some remarkable patterns. In fact, there are a number of regions where there are very, very tightly constrained orientations. For example, in Western Portugal, or Central Portugal, Western Iberia, that's very much the case. And indeed, in some cases, you can get reversals. So you have in one region of southern France, tombs face east. In the next region across the river, they face west, almost, as if intentionally diametrically opposed. If you look at that sort of phenomenon across Europe as a whole, Western Europe as a whole, you find that the prevalence of regular eastern orientations, or between east and south towards sunrise in the broad sense, is very strong in the south, is strong in Iberia, in southern France, in Western France, or most of Western France, certainly in southern Brittany, and then begins to break down in Britain and northern France, but is also found in Scandinavia as well to some degree. So I think it's an interesting question, because I don't think we have yet perhaps thought of that as being another way in which we could map potential patterns and interactions between the different regional groups of tombs in Europe. But I certainly think that going from Iberia up to Brittany, there is a strong sense that you're actually sharing a tradition of tomb orientation, as well as the burial practices and the tradition of megalithic monumentality in itself.
Thank you. Was there other questions? You're okay. All right. So my last question would be, as I said, you presented us with very strong case and with various strands of evidence. Is there any major criticism at this point of this theory you posed, or not any you know of?
Well, it's a question on which different people will place different emphases. I think I'd put it that way, because I think nobody would deny the reality of some of the connections that have been shown by the movement in materials, for example. I think the issue comes in interpreting that in terms of the impact of the cultural practices in one region on another region. And as I say, I mean, perhaps the question is, should we be surprised that there are connections between these regions? I mean, is that really, what is the default expectation? Is not the default expectation that there are indeed connections, perhaps going back into the Mesolithic between these different regions? And for example, we do know we have the settlement of several islands in the Mesolithic. And the sort of island communities suggest that people have got maritime abilities and they're able to settle offshore places and in some cases thrive there. So I think the question of connection is there. I think there are some sort of sub-questions which are more difficult. So for instance, are the direct maritime connections between Iberia and Brittany? Are there people sailing across the Bay of Biscay? And I think not. I think that people would almost always have been sailing around the coast. And once you start thinking in those terms and you look at the patterns of material distribution, you think, well, why are there gaps in the pattern? Well, not necessarily very surprising, but that would make you think again about the way in which these materials, these objects are actually being transferred. Is it knowledge carried by people individually traveling long distances, which it might be, or is it sometimes knowledge which is passing through several hands, as one person passes this on to another and so on and so forth, and the chain extends a long distance across Europe, but each individual link is quite short.
Okay. As it seems there are no more questions, so thank you very much, Chris, for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for this talk. It was great pleasure to have you here today, and yeah, many good luck with the new editions of The Human Past, and hopefully we will see each other with the rest of the audience next week during our last talk of the term. So have a nice day, or like the rest of the day, all of you, and yeah, see you next time.
Thank you.
Right. Goodbye.